Welcome to Between the Rows, where you get to hear the stories behind the stories in Canada's leading farm publications.
Hi, I'm Robert Arnason of the Western Producer. Welcome to another edition of Between the Rows. First up on today's show, Canada has been in a diplomatic battle with China for nearly 18 months. The squabble has had a massive impact on Canadian agriculture, disrupting exports of canola, beef, and pork, and many Canadians are now questioning our long-term relationship with China. Fortunately, Canada is not alone. Australia is also feuding with China, and its farmers may suffer the consequences. Here to discuss what's happening and what it means for Canada is Ed White, a reporter with the Western Producer in Winnipeg. Hey Ed, thanks for coming on Between the Rows.
Well, thanks for having me on.
So, I guess we'll just jump right into this. How did Australia get in trouble with China? What did they do?
Well, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has been pushing for an inquiry into how the COVID-19 pandemic arose and then how it was handled after breaking out in China. And that did not go over well with the Chinese government or what they call their diplomats.
Okay, so why don't we listen to a clip of the Australian Prime Minister as he's asking for an independent inquiry, just so we can hear it directly from him.
But the most likely has been in a wildlife wet market, and that wildlife wet market is an important definition of what we're talking about here. There are wet markets and there are wildlife wet markets. They're two different types of things. And that is the most likely outcome. But what's really important is that we have a proper review, an independent review, which looks into the sources of these things in a transparent way so we can learn the lessons to ensure that were there to be a virus of pandemic potential that would originate anywhere else in the world, we can learn the lessons from that. And that's what Australia is focused on. And I've written to all the G20 leaders to that end.
What is China threatening to do in retaliation? What are they talking about? What's the rhetoric?
Well, the Chinese ambassador to Australia, Cheng Jingye, was quite blunt, as we've found Chinese diplomats to be in the last few years. As you can remember, China's ambassador to Canada a year or two back was a pretty blunt fellow, speaking in ways that diplomats don't normally speak. He called the Morrison's call dangerous. He said it was resorting to suspicion, recrimination, or division at such a critical time. And he then did not threaten direct government action against Australian exports and other ways that China interacts with Australia, but he did threaten or suggest that non-government sources may act against Australia in terms of tourism, not going to Australia, which is it's a major earner for Australia, the tourism industry, especially with people from China these days. That's obviously not happening during the pandemic, but afterwards, that's something. Students going to their universities, and also here's one of his direct references to agriculture. It is up to the people to decide. Maybe the ordinary people will say, why should we drink our Australian wine? Eat Australian beef. So we've seen this before where the Chinese government sends a signal to what you would, I guess, call non-state actors within, non-government actors within China, and those can sort of whip up a populist nationalist movement against the country's products. And that did happen after China banned most Canadian canola exports, or most imports from Canada to China, where on Chinese social media, bulletin boards, other types of media within China, a lot of anti-Canadian sentiment was whipped up very quickly by these non-government actors.
Right. So it seems like Scott Morrison, Australia's Prime Minister, is determined to speak up about this, regardless of what the consequences are. How do you think that compares to how our government responded, I guess, about 18 months ago, when when we had the issue with Meng Wanzhou and Huawei, and then, of course, China had its quick response to that. And since that time, what has the Canadian government done?
Well, let me quote from an expert, Charles Burton, who is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I have a story with him coming out in the Western Producer this week. What he said to me when I asked him about this was, this is a direct quote from him, Canada has been much more accommodating to the Chinese regime than many other countries in the world. And he repeated that 2 or 3 times, that of all the developed world nations that are having these frequent tussles with China, and they're becoming more elevated and more frequent, it seems, these days, between developed world countries and China. Canada has pretty much bent over backwards to not provoke the Chinese, or not, another word that Mr. Burton used with me was to not inflame passions with the Chinese. So we've taken, like our government, the Liberal government has taken a much more conciliatory tone with the Chinese, whereas Morrison clearly is not really afraid of upsetting the Chinese.
So I guess the big question here, and we've talked about this many times, is why has our federal government been so soft on China? It's kind of confusing to many people. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just over the last couple of years of speaking with various, government officials in different departments, and I don't speak to the people at the top of foreign affairs, but agriculture people, various ministers, and just listening to what the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister and others have said, and the way they modulate their tones, you get a sense that they very much want to not provoke this, that they feel Canada is in a vulnerable position with all these tensions with the United States that came up over the NAFTA renewal, a possible cancellation, and that it just seems to be the Liberal government's approach to not be trying to get into fights in that way. The government has been willing to have people like, even a couple of weeks ago, Francois Philippe Champagne, our foreign minister, was willing to criticize the arrest in Hong Kong of democracy activists. And this drew another thunderous response from the Chinese government. But again, they have not generally been willing to stick it too much in China's face, often even in the House of Commons, not mentioning the word China when talking about diplomatic disputes.
So China and Australia have a free trade agreement, and yet, despite that agreement, China is making threats to punish Australia economically for Scott Morrison's comments. Canada was considering pursuing a free trade agreement with China. So what does this say about that? Is it actually worth it for Canada to go down this road, or would it change anything, really, having a free trade agreement?
Sometimes I think when we use that term free trade, it's difficult because it might create a false perception of what Canada's been trying to get with China. It seems a bit different than what we have with Mexico and the United States within the new NAFTA and the old NAFTA and the original free trade agreement. Sometimes it's probably better to use the term of just a trade agreement or an expanded trade agreement, because I think really for the last 3 years at least, I've been hearing from all sorts of people in different industries and within government that hopes of an actual kind of wide open free trade agreement like NAFTA with China just aren't really possible. But it would certainly be good for both Canada and China to have a better flow of goods in which there are, rather than things becoming political, they could be shunted off to regulators and bureaucrats on both sides, perhaps, to not let things become political. But a point that Mr. Burton made to me was that the problem with China and trade now is that China seems to use trade actions in response to political issues, almost a go-to mechanism or weapon. We saw that with canola. We're seeing that with these threats to Australian goods. We've seen that with even 10 years ago, China did this to Norway when it was mad about a Nobel Prize being given to a human rights activist from China. So the idea that we could depoliticize or scale down the chance of these trade or political issues impinging on trade maybe seems less likely to be successful when China turns to that almost right away these days.
All right, last question for you. 18 months ago, in November of 2018, there was a lot of optimism about our relationship with China and opportunities to expand trade with China. And here we are in the spring of 2020, and it's a lot of pessimism around. Is there a middle ground here, some sort of pragmatic approach we can take with China?
Yeah, I think we were just discussing how the hopes for a, quote, free trade agreement are probably dashed and on ice for a long time. But the idea of more back and forth trade, there's no reason to think that that's not possible, because really China still relies so heavily on many imports of the kind of commodities Canada produces. And the reason I started looking at this story that I worked on and interviewed Mr. Burton about was that I was thinking, well, in Canada, we're always thinking about how we're fighting with China over trade, and we think we have it particularly bad. But if you look around, China is locked in battles that involve trade and politics being mixed up with, obviously, the United States, but this case is Australia, and it looks pretty bad right now for the moment. They're not having easy relationships with Japan, Korea. There are many other places that China has disputes with. So we are not necessarily in a unique at all situation with China. They're very mad at us, but they're very mad at, it seems like, a lot of countries. So they need to import some things. We would like to buy things from there. We'd like there to be some interaction back and forth. So, that strikes me as basis for some sort of a deal that somebody could work out. It's just the details will be hard to see until maybe things cool down a bit or they just become normalized in this frosty way.
All right, thanks, Ed. That was Ed White, a reporter with the Western Producer in Winnipeg, who spoke about China and its feud with Australia and many other countries in the world. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Robert.
Cheers. Next up, the pandemic has slashed demand for certain commodities like corn because demand for ethanol has collapsed. But sales of chickpeas, beans, and pulse flour have exploded. It's possible that 2020 could represent a turning point for the pulse industry, creating a new base level for demand. Here to talk about the boom in peas, lentils, and chickpeas is Sean Pratt, a reporter with the Western Producer in Saskatchewan. Sean joins us from his home in Saskatoon. Hi, Sean.
Hey, Robert.
Thanks for coming on the show. So,
no problem.
You recently listened to a presentation on pulses from Matt Tripodi, who is with Euromonitor International. So what is Euromonitor, and what did Matt have to say?
Well, Euromonitor bills itself as the world's largest consumer insight company. So basically, they track what consumers are doing. And he rattled on about the presentation, and at the end he said something really interesting. He said the global pulse industry is finally coming out from beneath a rock. And he said, I'm not sure everybody recognizes the enormity of what is happening. So he explained himself a bit, saying that there's just sort of a conflux of events that are leading to increased sales of products like peas and lentils and chickpeas and beans. And one of them is just like the alternative meat sector that's really taken off. So he says that is prompting huge sales of pulse ingredients. So that was one of the big changes that he's seen. He also talked a bit about COVID-19, as you mentioned in your introduction. It has really sparked demand for items like beans and chickpeas. People are grabbing them off the shelves and still are to some extent. And he phrased it. He said that's really reintroducing pulses to a lot of consumers around the world that have forgotten what the ingredients were all about.
Okay, so I mean, I imagine this demand is, as you said, more than just about COVID-19. You know, it's more than just grocery store madness and people grabbing every can they can find on the shelf. You know, what else is happening here? What's the bigger picture?
Well, you know, as I said before, a lot of what's driving this is the demand for these meat alternative products. You know, like Beyond Meat, and I can't remember some of the other ones that are out there, but Burger King has one that they have as well, the Impossible Burger.
Right.
But there's all sorts of those, a proliferation of those kind of products, and a lot of those use pea flour in them, or the other pulse ingredients. So that has really kick-started a new source of demand for pulses. And he also mentioned there's the growing vegan movement. He said that in many countries, anywhere from about 2% to 14% of the population identifies as vegan. And he said that is a lot different than it was 10 years ago. So that, too, is also driving demand for pulses.
So I understand that China is part of this. Why would Chinese consumers want more pulses? I thought that sort of pork and meat dominates their diet when it comes to protein.
Well, it does, and it will going forward dominate as well. But there's a growing mistrust of food in that country, and he touched on that, saying that a lot of consumers are leery about consuming meat products in China. There have been some incidents over the years, and now this whole COVID-19 thing, they believe it came from consuming animals, and so there's this growing distrust of meat products, and so that is helping fuel demand for vegetable-based protein. So that's one of the reasons there. And another in China, obviously it still does have a thriving livestock sector. And for a while, soybeans were priced out of the market there. Mm-hmm. And so the peas were a feed substitute in China as well. So There was that demand for a while there.
So, Canada, as you well know, major producer of pulse crops. What's the big opportunity here? Has the industry sort of set some targets or goals going forward in terms of increased production, increased sales?
Yeah, they sure have. I spoke to Julianne Curran. She's the Vice President of Market Innovation with Pulse Canada. And she agreed that there really is a shift in pulse demand, unprecedented growth there. And she said that she likens it to pulses moving from a niche ingredient into something more mainstream. And she feels that's happening sort of as we speak. And so the pulse industry, they set a goal of developing, this is back in 2017, set a goal of having 25% of pulse production going into new markets. And she said because of this sort of explosion in meat alternative products and veganism and COVID-19 sort of helping boost sales as well, and other factors, that she says they're well on their way to meeting that demand. Although she mentioned that they are far from achieving that goal. As of right now, they still have a lot of work to do. And she mentioned that they can't just sort of focus in on one aspect of the market, like meat alternatives. They have to have a very diversified market for pulses in the food ingredient market. Okay.
So last question for you, Sean. So you've been covering the pulse sector in Canada and around the world for quite a while now. What's your sense of this? Is there something really happening here, or is this a blip in the marketplace? What's your take?
Well, I guess we have to rely on the experts. They know a lot more than I do. And it sure seems like something's happening. Like I haven't heard this kind of language coming out of pulse industry officials or industry observers before. This seems like something really new and kind of exciting. But we have to remember that the backdrop of all this is that India, which had been Canada's number one customer for pulses by a long shot, has really backed away from the market in a big, big way because they've been producing big crops themselves. So they've been meeting a lot of their own demand and throwing up barriers such as tariffs and quotas. So, you know, while demand in the food ingredient sector in North America and elsewhere is taking off, this demand for whole pulses that existed for so many years in India seems to be evaporating. So I think that kind of balances things out a bit.
Okay. Thanks, Sean. That was Sean Pratt, a reporter with the Western Producer in Saskatoon. Thanks for coming on the show, Sean. The last few winters have been tough for winter wheat growers in Western Canada, as the crop has had high levels of winter kill. This spring looks much more promising, as winter wheat is in good shape on most of the prairies. Gord Gilmour, the editor of the Manitoba Co-operator, recently spoke with Ken Gross, an agronomist with Ducks Unlimited Canada, about the condition of winter wheat crops and shared some tips for growers.
We're joined now by Ken Gross of Ducks Unlimited, who's going to tell us a little bit about winter cereals. Ken, thanks for joining us.
Hello, Gord. Thanks for having me.
So what are winter cereal growers finding this spring as they get out there and look at their crops?
Well, so far across the prairies, our staff had visited a number of fields, and so far we see no issues at all with winter survival.
And what are they looking at as they're looking at these stands and determining what's going on with survival?
Well, two things that we look at is we always like to dig up a few plants and do an evaluation, what we call a bag test, which means we remove some plants, bring them indoors into some nicer temperatures, and see if the shoots and the roots regrow. And the leaves always seem to regrow very quickly. It's the roots that are the key thing. And this year we're seeing very good root growth, very, very quickly, very vigorous growth. So that's a really good sign. The other thing that we're trying to do is some plant counts out there. We always like to see more than 20 plants per square foot in a field. And that provides a pretty good stand that's competitive and should yield well. And so far, the stands that we're evaluating are well above 20 plants a square foot. So everything looks like it's looking good for the spring.
So it sounds like a good spring for the crops and a good spring for evaluating them. That must take a little bit of the guesswork out. I know it's always a little tricky in the spring when they're looking at them, that sometimes folks will go out there, they'll look at them and they'll be panicking because they don't see anything growing and that sort of thing. Is it typically something they got to kind of exercise a little patience with in the spring?
Usually patience is a good thing with the winter wheat crops because you can look at them and they can look brown and you think they're dead, but they're not really. That's just being frost damaged leaves. The new leaves haven't come up yet, and they can look green and then later die out. So it's always best to wait until the middle of May after you've had some decent soil temperatures. Our soil temperatures are finally starting to get to the point where you're going to start seeing some rapid growth, especially with the forecasts that we have going forward from this date. So yeah, give it a chance to get some warm soil temperatures and away they go.
So now that they've established that their crop has overwintered well, then what's their next step? What would you like to see the winter wheat grower out in the field doing right now?
Well, right now, fertility is the major thing. Really, if a producer hasn't put their fertility on last fall, they should get out there as soon as they can get on the field and put it on. And it's very critical for winter wheat because it does two things. One is it helps the plant establish and grow very vigorously, which makes it competitive against weeds. But even more important than that, the seed head is not developed in winter wheat until the very first thing in the spring. And so when that seed head is being developed, you want the fertility there to grow a big, healthy seed head. And so you can maximize your yield potential. So right now, up until about the 5th leaf stage is the time to get out there. And the earlier you do it, the higher your yield potential is.
Mm. Now, acreage has fallen a bit in recent years. I'll just read you some figures that I came across when I did a little quick research on that. In 2018, Manitoba had about 70,000 acres, now down to 45,000 in the year just finished in 2019. Alberta was up modestly over the same span. I think it was about 5,000 acres. And Saskatchewan had a pretty significant drop too, although proportionally not as big as Manitoba. What's been going on there? Why have growers kind of not been able to get out and plant?
Well, there's 2 or 3 major factors going on right now. About 5 years ago now, some of the high yielding spring wheats from Ontario started coming into Manitoba in particular. And, that was always the biggest advantage winter wheat had over spring wheat was the yield. It traditionally yielded 20 to 40% higher than spring wheat. And with those new varieties, that started to shrink that advantage. And then the summer conditions were a little bit more favorable for spring wheat for a number of years than it was for winter wheat. We had last year, for instance, was a very, very dry spring, which the winter wheat just sat there waiting. Nothing grows without moisture, and there's no moisture in the soil. We didn't get any rains until the middle of June, so it wasn't as competitive as it normally is. And so that was advantageous to spring wheat. And the third thing is we've had some really bad falls. We made it very difficult to get winter wheat in the ground. Again, last fall in Manitoba, across the prairies, we had very wet conditions, early on in September, and then it snowed, and it made it impossible for producers to get it into the ground. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing that's going on is that there is a hybrid rye varieties coming out now. And I know quite a few winter wheat growers have switched over to seeding the hybrid rye and had some pretty good luck with them. And so in Manitoba, I think those acres are almost up to about 100,000 acres of hybrid rye now. So they're taking over some of the traditional winter wheat acres.
Yeah, I've actually heard that particular rye variety, it's been a bit of a world beater. Is that it's kind of upended things a bit then in your sense?
A little bit. The producers look at fall rye as a little bit more bulletproof than winter wheat. It overwinters better. It starts growing more vigorously in the spring. It's pretty competitive against weeds, just like winter wheat. And so yeah, they've had some good luck with it. But there are some new winter wheats on the horizon here that I'm pretty excited about that should yield better and take away some of our winter survival issues.
And actually, that's the next thing I want to talk to you about. Can you tell us a little bit about those higher yielding spring varieties?
Yeah, I'm really excited about Gold Rush and Wildfire, the 2 varieties that I'm keeping my eye on. And Wildfire, we finally got some into the province last fall. So actually brought a truck in for a few producers to get some seed, which was very difficult to locate last fall. But it is a really high yielding winter wheat. The yields under irrigation in Alberta were over 140 bushels an acre. And then in the following year, when it was really, really dry in southern Alberta, this is where they've had most of their experience with it, it still yielded 70 bushels an acre. So I'm really curious to see if we have the same results here in Manitoba. And it has a winter hardiness rating of very good, which is better than Emerson and far better than the Falcon and Gateways that we're used to. So nice package there. And the other one is Gold Rush, and it has a better disease package than Wildfire. It's also got a very good rating for winter hardiness, but its key is that it has a higher protein than anything else that what we're growing here. So 10% higher. And that traditionally has been an issue with winter wheats is lower protein has been an issue, and it's made it harder for them to market. And the newer winter wheats, that doesn't seem to be the same kind of issue.
So it sounds like there's some things that'll be changing in the near future then. So you were saying you got a truck in last fall of one of the varieties so they could try it out. So we're really just looking at then the first production season that it's been here in Manitoba. Is that correct?
That's as far as the fields that I'll be following, yeah, it's the first one that I've seen on a field scale. I have seen it in some of the McVet trials that the province puts together, but I haven't seen fields of it in Manitoba, and it's always interesting to see how something performs in a field.
Of course, yeah. Well, we'll have to get together again this fall to talk about it then and see how it yielded out. I'm very curious myself.
Excellent.
Thanks a lot for joining us today, Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Gord.
That was Ken Gross, an agronomist with Ducks Unlimited Canada, speaking with Gord Gilmour, the editor of the Manitoba Co-operator. Next up on the show, corn and oat futures have moved in opposite directions over the last month. Corn prices have tanked, while oat prices have risen. Joining us to discuss those trends and the latest news from the commodity markets is Phil Franz Warkentin, a reporter with Glacier Markets Farm. Hi, Phil.
Hi.
So, corn has had a rough patch the last couple months, going from about nearly $4 US in February to about $3.25 per bushel now. What's this all about? Is it just about ethanol, or are there other things going on?
Yeah, ethanol's the big one, and the whole COVID-19 pandemic and all that, what has meant for oil prices. So oil's gone down. Ethanol has tanked even more so. Many U.S. plants have shut their doors, so that's cutting into the the demand for corn. All the issues in the livestock sector with slaughterhouses closing, that's leading to other issues in the corn market as well. You see the reports on the news of pigs and chickens with nowhere to go being basically just dumped, so they're not eating corn anymore.
Okay. So are there any signs that corn prices have hit the bottom and there could be a bit of a recovery here, or is there still room to fall further?
Yeah, the from what I'm hearing, you'd think that kind of $3 mark might be a magic number and provide some support, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Definitely hearing some analysts thinking it'll go sub $3. They're just getting underway seeding, or I shouldn't say underway. The last report, they're just over half done seeding the U.S. corn crop. That's well ahead of last year's pace. So there's thoughts that their farmers are doing so well seeding corn. Hey, maybe they'll seed more than had been the original thoughts. Because there had been some ideas that with all this issues with weak corn prices and whatnot, that we'd see less acres go in the ground to corn, but that might not prove to be the case given the good U.S. seeding pace so far. So could be a lot more corn around that'll just keep things heavy.
All right. So the opposite is kind of happening with oats. There's sort of a rally, or you could call it a mini rally, happening in the last months or weeks. What's driving that rally, or what's pushing oats higher?
Yeah, oats get they're getting more support based off of that whole sort of consumer sentiment that of stockpiling, and it's not the same extent as everyone buying flour to bake bread, but oatmeal's a fairly large staple, so there's been kind of an increased demand on the consumer side for sort of food, and oats is more, trades off of that more than corn, which is more of a feed grain market. Oats has its own feed channels as well, but the human consumption drives it a bit more, so that's seen a bit more of an increased demand, helping underpin things there the last little while.
Okay. So let's just look at the bigger picture here, beyond things like oats and corn. There has been some rumblings or sort of heated rhetoric going back and forth between the U.S. and China that trade battle might heat up again. How is that playing out in the market?
Yeah, that kind of when you think that is done, it all of a sudden comes back, and there's more shots fired in that ever ongoing trade war. The latest was over the past weekend. Trump was out there blaming China for the pandemic, and we're going to retaliate against them, or the U.S. is going to retaliate against China over these unsubstantiated claims, basically, and so we're going to put in more tariffs. They kind of walked that back now today, but that's soybean prices were down yesterday. down a bit. The yesterday being Monday, Tuesday they're still a bit softer, closer to unchanged, as sort of that comments got walked back a bit, but notably not by Trump himself. So there's still, the China situation between the U.S. and China is far from settled, and as it's been the last year, 2 years, or from day to day, week to week, it seems there's constantly a new story. So it's kind of concerns are weighing on prices now, but who knows what what will change.
Just for the sake of clarity, the comments were made by, I think, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, basically suggesting that the source of the COVID-19 outbreak was a lab in Wuhan, that perhaps there was some malfeasance or malpractice or some sort of error there that led to the outbreak, correct?
Yeah, Pompeo said that over the weekend.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure we're clear on that. So again, bringing this back to Canada, Statistics Canada will release an acreage report this week. What are you hearing? What are you expecting from this report? Will there be anything in there of significance?
Well, it's as always with all these Statistics Canada reports, the trade always takes them with a bit of a grain of salt. But they are the official numbers. There might be a little, who knows what it has been delayed this year due to the pandemic delaying things a bit. So, and on top of that, price changes over the last month that might lead to more acreage shifts. But overall, the kind of general thoughts on canola is that most people are calling for a slight decline in canola area on the year, although there are some saying it could be up. Opinions are divided, up 1 million acres, down 1 million acres, but the average guesses are for a slight dip, maybe 20.5 million acres compared to 21 last year. Wheat, similar deal there. Some people thinking larger wheat acres, some less. I think Durham's seen good strength in prices the last while, so that might be of all the wheats, might see a bit more Durham in the ground. Pulses as well over the last month, they've lentils in particular have seen strength based off of the increased demand, so that might swing a bit more area into lentils and peas.
All right. Well, it's always an interesting time of year when spring planting is happening, because there's always weather incidents or something happening that kind of pushes markets up and down. But anyway, thanks, Phil. That was Phil Franz-Workington, a reporter with Glacier's Markets Farm in Winnipeg. This is Robert Arnason of the Western Producer. Thanks for listening, and best of luck with Plant 2020.
Between the Rows is a production of Glacier FarmMedia, Canada's leading farm publisher. We'd love to hear what you think of the show and invite you to send your comments to btr@farmmedia.com or visit us at membersgetmore.ca and sign up today